Hello, my name is Seth Spain. I'm a professor of organizational behavior and human resource management at Concordia University in Montreal, Quebec. Um, I've decided to start putting up a variety of my lectures. Mostly I'm going to be focusing on on courses for my students, but I think that it's necessary to also educate the populace in things that I think are important. So today I'm going to be recording the first lecture for my industrial organizational psychology class, which I taught for several semesters when I was a graduate student at the University of Illinois. So the important thing here is I like to tell people why I chose to be an industrial organizational psychologist, because a lot of people are not familiar with the domain. I wanted to be possibly a cognitive psychologist or a cognitive neuroscientist, and I decided to roll the dice, as it were, and apply to programs in both for my PhD, and based on where I got accepted to try to decide what I would do. And I remained at the University of Illinois, which was, top two or three in the country, in the United States, that is, um, when I was accepted for industrial organizational psychology. But what really made my decision for me were writings by one of my mentors, Charles Hewlin, essentially about the centrality of work, what it means to people. And I can't think of anything better than this quotation from Martin Luther King Jr. If a man is called to be a street sweeper, he should sweep streets even as Michelangelo painted, Beethoven composed music, or Shakespeare wrote poetry. He should sweep streets so well that all heaven and earth will pause to say, here lived a great street sweeper who did his job well. The work that we do is central to our identity in many ways. Um, that's what really comes through. A lot of us wear it on as our name, or at least an ancestor's work. If your name is, Miller, Cooper, Brewer, any of those things, that's a job that presumably some ancestor of yours had. Even my own name, Spain, the country, it derives from the fact that I almost certainly had ancestry who were Spanish merchants traveling around Western Europe to sell their wares. And some of them settled in Ireland and England. My ancestry is Irish on the Spain side, so I presume that's where the Spaniards settled once upon a time, and they came to be known exactly as the Spaniards, and hence the name Spain, D'Espagne, Español, and such, all around Ireland, England, France, and so forth. So we carry this around with us a lot of times. If you meet a new person, one of the first things they'll ask you is, what do you do? And most of us, in fact, in general, if we're asked much about ourselves, our work is going to be one of the first things we talk about. So understanding it, trying to make it better, help people experience work in a better way was highly motivational to me. So here we are. So today, what we're going to talk about is a little bit of background. We're going to try to understand the following terms and leading figures associated with them. So the history of sort of work psychology in scientific management, the human relations movement, and action research. Try to recognize instances of the so-called Hawthorne effect and have a general grasp of the intellectual background of industrial organizational psychology. And then we'll also, if there's time today, which again, since I'm recording this, there will be, but I'll probably put it off for another video, basic science issues. So, as I said, work is pervasive. It's a huge part of our lives. We don't spend any more. The only thing that most people spend more time doing than being at work is sleeping. Work is fundamentally characteristic of how people identify themselves, how they gauge their value to their families, to society, and everything else. And so it can tell us a lot about human behavior in general, this single central focus of people's lives. So, um, This is something I like to ask people, and so I ask you to continue to think about it. If you were able to get enough money to live as comfortably as you like for the rest of your life, would you keep working or stop working? Now, since I can't see any of you, I won't know how you respond to this. But in general, I'd say about 70% of the classes that I've asked this question to say they would continue working. The people who don't generally say that they would like to travel or spend more time with their families. But most people say I would like to continue working. And when I ask them questions about that, what happens? Well, it structures their day, gives them a reason to get up in the morning, provides them goals to achieve, things like that. That's why people tend to say, yes, I want to keep working. Aside from which, every once in a while, there's someone who's a little bit more introspective. We'll talk about how they just wouldn't know what to do with themselves otherwise. That their work, or at least the possibility of work, gives them meaning. And in general, as long as the National Research Council has asked this question, the vast majority of people have responded yes, they would keep working. So now people get a little bit confused about this. So I say I'm an industrial organizational psychologist. There's sort of two halves to this, but there's not a huge distinction between them. It's probably more the same than it is different. So industrial psychology, which is also sometimes known as personnel psychology, is usually concerned with human performance at work. So things like selecting personnel, training them, appraising their performance, aspects related to employment law, but basically human resources type stuff, at least on the sort of staffing side of human resources. Organizational psychology is more worker-centered. It's about workers' emotions, attitudes, and reactions and behavior in the work environment. And there are other sorts of things like human engineering or ergonomics that overlap with this, and also things like organizational theory and organizational development. And we'll assuming these lectures go on for a reasonable length of time, we'll actually cover a bit of organizational culture issues, which are closer to that sort of macro organizational behavior or org theory type stuff. And certainly we'll talk a bit about organizational development as time goes on. But that's also a false dichotomy. There's topics bounce around. For instance, attitudes can fall on either side depending on whether they're really an outcome or an input to whatever system you're looking at. So if I'm concerned with what causes people to be satisfied by their jobs, I'm probably taking an organizational psych perspective. But if I'm interested in what features, in what, say, attitudes as a cause of turnover, well, then I'm probably taking a more industrial perspective. So in general, this is what it is. For instance, both sides are concerned with performance as broadly defined. Attitudes matter in both sides. Like various aspects of individual differences matter all over the place. So it's not like these are easy to separate. And in general, like research as the field has matured over the last 100 years or so, it's the research has become increasingly complex. Topics that would have fallen more squarely in one category or the other have become important to the other category, I guess is probably the best way of putting it. So this is a rough timeline of things, and I'm just going to close down my video for a second here to talk about this more clearly. The earliest thing we can talk about is James McKean Cattell attempting to measure individual differences in the late 1880s. In 1890, Cattell develops the first mental test, essentially what we would call roughly an IQ test today. In 1892, Hugo Munsterberg arrived at Harvard. Munsterberg wrote the first industrial organizational psychology type textbook in 1913, 1917. In World War One, various people developed, Scott and Bam developed the Army Alpha, which was the first mental ability test used for selection of the officer ranks, and William Gilbraith earned the first industrial organizational psychology PhD that year. Elton Mayo published his Hawthorne studies in 1930. 1941, engineering psychology applied to solve various aircraft accidents, and we'll talk that will become relevant later on in the lectures if we follow up. The Civil Rights Act of 1964 was extremely important to developing important personnel law. And then finally, SIOP, the Society for Industrial Organizational Psychology, was founded in 1982. Get a preview back here. Really, the pioneers of what we think of as industrial organizational psychology were Hugo Munsterberg and James McKeen Cattell. They're both William Wundt students. So if you've taken basic psychology, you know that Wundt established the first experimental psychology lab in Germany in the late 19th century. And so, in general, most psychologists traced their intellectual ancestry to Wundt in some way or other. There is an independent tradition, especially in American psychology, of people who trace their ancestry to William James, who established the first psychology lab at Harvard, but was not trained by Wundt. So there's whatever. Both were trained. Well, I already said that. Cattell was interested in reliable individual differences, so he used the same kinds of tests that Wundt used in his laboratory, but Wundt was interested in the average tendencies. So he's interested in sort of like using psychological stimuli, tests, and so forth to talk about sort of the general human nature. Whereas what Cattell was interested in was he noticed that people tended to make the same sorts of quote unquote errors over and over again, and that might reflect interesting, reliable variants for that person. So, you know, maybe you hit the button too quickly on average for yourself, or something along those lines. Munsterberg was one of the first people to actually take stuff out of the lab and into the workplace. So you wanted to try to measure workers' abilities and tie them to performance. So basically you wanted to be able to predict who would be good at specific jobs, so that you could not just effectively randomly hire people, but just say like, this person is probably going to be good for this job. And he also, as I mentioned in the timeline, wrote the first IO Psych textbook. Walter Dill Scott and Walter Van Dyke Bingham, Waltz, developed, well, they started off as essentially working in the ad world and sales, and developed selection and training methods therein. Then, you know, World War I happened. They got effectively conscripted and used their expertise to try to develop tests that would work to help predict who could be an effective officer in the Army. So they developed a test called the Army Alpha. It was the first group administered intelligence test, so you could give it to lots of people all at once, as opposed to the more psychologically oriented Stanford Binet and previous quote unquote intelligence tests. And believe me, we will be breaking down the concept of intelligence as measured by tests later on. So if that gives you any concerns, yeah, we're going to talk about it. But it was derived from those tests, but built to be administered to large groups at once. And it was written, but they also developed something called the Army Beta, which was an attempt to measure the intelligence of people who were illiterate or functionally so. So it involved images, spatial manipulation, objects, those sorts of things. Because again, the idea that they had, which I think is a very legitimate one, is that just because someone has not been taught how to read doesn't mean that they're stupid. They may be capable of making like the kind of abstract problem solving, reasoning, and management that's necessary for a military officer, even though they can't read. They can have people read for them if it came to that, or probably be taught to read relatively quickly. So I think this is one of the things where there is this, despite some of the more unsavory history of intelligence tests, some psychologists have consistently tried to use it for relatively progressive purposes to help people who might otherwise get the short end of the stick to have more opportunities, because you can point to something that's at least quasi-objective to make the decision. And also, as I mentioned, around the same time, William Gilbreth earned the first PhD in IO psychology in the United States. Um, Again, from that standpoint, some IO psychologists, we tend to be a bit proud that the first PhD in the topic was a woman. So I don't know if that's something that's important to anyone, but it's there. Okay, now we have to get into Taylorism. So scientific management was an idea put forward by the industrial engineer Frederick Winslow Taylor. And the basic principles were that jobs could be scientifically studied, and that there was, especially for physical jobs, a one best method for doing them, and that there needs to be a match between a worker's particular abilities and skills and the job tasks. And the assumptions were built on a very sort of like classical economic structure, when the money is the primary motivator. Like that's the reward you give people, and that sort of reflecting the engineering background, the tools and work systems need to be designed to fit the needs of the worker. Taylor used these time and motion studies, so clipboard, stopwatch, watching people do the job to sort of time down specific movements that a worker would do and try to find out which were the most efficient ways of doing it. So if we saw somebody shuffling, for instance, and one person could do a particular part of the shuffling motion more quickly than somebody else, you try to figure out why it was happening more quickly, and then you could train people to use the most efficient method at each stage. Frank, Lillian Galbraith again, and her husband Frank, used this to increase the efficiency in many domains. For instance, they increased the output of laborers loading pig iron ingots by 4 times, something like that. And the interesting thing here is sometimes it wasn't just about that. Like people in the scientific management domain discovered that, hey, breaks are actually important. You need to offer regular breaks to workers, and they can perform more efficiently while they're working if they've had an opportunity to rest, as opposed to just driving them to the end. Now, there are limitations here. For instance, it's very much focused on physical labor, so it doesn't work very well with more white-collar jobs or things that involve a lot of mental work. It also is limited in the fact that people are motivated by more than just money. The Hawthorne studies in the 1930s. Elton Mayo became involved in a series of studies at the Hawthorne, Illinois plant of the Western Electric Company. It was a human engineering project, so they tried to vary workplace conditions to find out what helps and hinders performance. So basically, this was started off very much in the scientific management domain, but in particular, so these were mostly women workers who were assembling electrical relays. And one of the things that they varied was lighting conditions. So they made the lights brighter and productivity improved, and they made them brighter and improved. And basically what they saw was like production kept going up no matter what they did. So they tried dimming it. Production went down, or went up again. So basically all that happened, like any change they made, performance improved. Now, again, there are some problems with the Hawthorne studies. I want to be quite honest about that. So I think people, we need to take this with a grain of salt. But the main thing that we take away from this is, as an example of what people call the Hawthorne effect, which is a particular kind of sort of subject effect in general experimental parlance, that people know that they're being studied. They know that something's going on. So when Mayo talked to people, they noticed that this was this is a demand effect, because, well, people know what's going on, so they're like, hey, you're trying to do something, so we're going to respond. Now, again, this could be work either way, depending on what the employees or the people being studied think is happening. Another study, for instance, productivity fell following the changes, so workers believed that studies would result in more demanding quotas, so they adjusted downward. Again, and so they're attempting to say, like, let's set the bar low, and then that way we can work however we want to afterwards. So again, this is a demand effect, and it's a demand effect that's operating through a kind of subject effect. People know they have a guess. They know they're being studied, and they have a guess about what the results will be or will be used for, and therefore attempt to manipulate their behavior in a way that produces the results that they think they want. So Mayo discovered that, well, people think about stuff. They do things, that they value things besides money, particularly comfort and social interaction. So this led to the core beliefs of what he called the human relations movement. That good relationships are the most important determinant of productivity. Social factors will override financial considerations in many cases, and workers are more responsive to peers' values than those of management. Again, so people work for money. So, like, the human relations movement is sort of a pendulum swinging away from scientific management, where money is the only motivator. But I love my job. But if I'm not getting paid for it, I need to find other work, right? I've got a family to feed, a house to pay for, all those sorts of things. So in general, like, people are motivated by multiple things. They want control, they want power, they want relationships, they want friendship, but they need money on top of all of that. So that's part of what goes on here, that both of these perspectives are somewhat limited in that they have narrow views of human motivation. Um, World War II, human engineering was applied to aircraft cockpit design, and the Army General Classification Test was developed. So an extension, so using psychological principles to help better design the environments that people work with, as well as improving the use of psychological tests as an element of selection and placement within the Army. Uh, Also, during this time, Henry Murray essentially ported the concept of an assessment center from England, which was developed in World War I in Germany, actually, to select officers. And an assessment center is placing people through a bunch of behavioral simulations so that you assess them on their performance and to try to figure out if they're going to be good. So in this case, Henry Murray was working for the predecessor of the Central Intelligence Agency, the Office of Strategic Services, the OSS. They were trying to pick spies, because originally they basically said to themselves, okay, well, spies are sneaky, duplicitous liars. So they recruited a bunch of criminals, gave them money and guns, and dropped them behind enemy lines in Europe. And they vanished with the money and guns, typically. So what they were trying to find was, how is a way that we identify people who are capable of being sneaky, duplicitous liars, but are not criminals? So Murray attempted to use this assessment center technique to assess their personalities and abilities. The simulations possess abilities to deal with stressful circumstances and frustrating ones. So, for instance, the stress test, people were when they came into the assessment center, they were given a cover identity, and they were not supposed to break that cover identity unless they were told that they were under condition X, which was when people could act themselves. So in the stress test, people were interrogated by New York City prosecutors, and they were told that they had been discovered that they were spies, they were under arrest, and all of this. So interrogated like crazy, the whole lights and all of that. But that wasn't the real test. The real test was afterwards. There was a Confederate waiting in the hallway, just reading a newspaper, who would talk kindly to the person who had just come out of the interrogation. And the real test was, does the person break cover under those circumstances where they think that they have failed? Similarly, the alcohol test was, Murray and the other assessors would wheel in a cart of alcohol, and everybody got to drink it. And as people got progressively, including the assessors, and as people got more and more intoxicated, would they break cover? Simulations like, and then there were simulations like just you have to learn a map to find your way out of a situation, or you're given 5 minutes to examine a room and try to figure out anything that you could about the person who occupied that room, any important information about them. So things like that. Also, lots of things like trying to build a bridge, a footbridge across a creek with two Confederates who were incompetent and things like that. After the war, Kurt Lewin, I'll call him Lewin from here on, but he's German, so it should be Lewin, was the founder of a technique called action research. So he fled the Nazis in 1933, and he was already an established socialist psychologist coming from more of a Gestalt tradition. But he moved to Iowa, amongst other places, and studied group dynamics, motivation, leadership, all sorts of stuff. But basically, action research is the idea that gets ported into organizational development and some other aspects of organizational behavior, where the researcher views himself as working in collaboration with the host organization to solve their problems. So it's not just a scientific study, but it is. So you're sort of like the idea of like embedded journalism. This is an embedded research. So the researcher is an active part of the assessments. They are present, and this is a forerunner of what is typically used in both clinical and industrial organizational psychology, which is a scientist practitioner model. That as an industrial organizational psychologist, I am a consultant to the organizations that I work with. I'm there to try to assess their problems, identify their strengths, weaknesses, strategies, those sorts of things, and help them to gather data and test hypotheses about what could improve the situation, what's causing their difficulties, challenges, those sorts of things. And so the basic idea is this is a reciprocal process, that good science informs good practice, and good practice informs good science. This means that, well, they mutually influence one another. I mean, so now the idea here is you can take existing science, things we already know, and apply it to new problems, or you can use current problems to direct novel scientific research. So if an organization has a problem that you've never seen before, that you would use scientific methods to approach it, to try to pin down the boundaries of that problem, to identify where it's coming from, what its potential causes are, try to isolate variables, all of the standard sort of scientific things that we would normally do. And again, I'll talk more about general scientific issues in a future video. There's one other intellectual sort of like precursor to industrial organizational psychology, and that's the sociologist Max Weber. And he developed the principles of bureaucracy. So the basic idea is that organizations should be designed such that employees always know what they're supposed to be doing. Like there shouldn't be any ideally uncertainty in what tasks you're responsible for. And part of the way of doing that is having clear lines of authority. So this is something like the idea is that you should be able to sum up the organization with an organization chart very, very clearly. And moreover, that there should be rules and merit-based approaches to advancement and remuneration. So raises, promotions, bonuses, those sorts of things should be set on merit in a way that requires a kind of fairness in that people know what's expected of them, and if they accomplish it, they get that reward, and otherwise. And again, while there are probably some things that, much like Taylor, there are things that we could probably criticize about Weber. He wasn't just an armchair sociologist. He collected data. He attempted to test these ideas. I also mentioned in the timeline the Civil Rights Act of 1964, which was legislation that banned discriminatory practices in employment. It's designed to protect underrepresented groups. So, in particular, in 1964, this was to protect Black Americans to help prevent discrimination against them, and hiring and advancement in at least reasonably sized work organizations. And so it forced those businesses to take a close look at their selection and promotion practices, including the various psychological tests that they used. And industrial organizational psychologists have been at the forefront of designing methods and standards by which those methods can be evaluated for their fairness and unbiasedness in testing, selection, and general decision making overall. So where do we go from here? So there's current concerns, impact of technology on the workplace. Again, there's a reason I'm recording this from home. We're like in the midst of the coronavirus pandemic. Many of us, if we're able to, are working from home. That wasn't seriously possible in this magnitude not too long ago. In general, like how can we use technology to better administer the kinds of decision-making tools that we normally use, but also how can we use them to make better decisions? So, machine learning, artificial intelligence, and those sorts of decision support approaches have become increasingly prominent over the last few years. What are the effects of globalization? I'm an expatriate. I live in Canada, but I was born in the United States. And this is increasingly common by people. It has been a global labor market for a long time. Things might change going forward after this current crisis. Who knows? But I don't expect that we're going to see a less globalized labor market in any meaningful way. So what happens there? What about cultural competence, multiculturalism, and both ethnic, racial, gender, and cultural diversity in the workplace, and the differences in how various national cultures and legal environments deal with those things, group and team level variables. So again, we are psychologists, but we are aware that in larger social and organizational structures, those structures themselves take on characteristics that impact the individuals involved. So it is possible to have team level characteristics that affect how people behave, perform, and think, and certainly how they feel. Workforces in countries around the world are aging, and what does that imply? Similarly, the gig economy is strongly affecting younger workers. There's fewer and fewer the sector of the labor market that is a traditional salaried or wage-based job is smaller than it has ever been, and the section that involves contingent workers and so forth is larger than ever. And something that's particularly interesting to me is the role that time and dynamic processes take in all of this. So those are places where we we have been of contemporary interest and I think are going to be of future interest. Um, oh, sorry, those are examples that we don't need right now because I don't have them to play. The last slide we're just going to ignore. So that's the beginning here. If you found it interesting, I hope you stick around. I'll be putting on more of these as time goes on. And thank you for your time. If you liked it, I guess leave a like, consider subscribing, etc. The usual YouTube platitudes. Thanks. Have a good one. Bye bye.